part of in a very unique and pivotal conversation. This event is done in conjunction with Caliba and Mosaic. Caliba, of course, everybody here probably knows, is California Independent Booksellers Association or Alliance. It's the trade organization for indie bookstores in California. Mosaic Committee is made up of booksellers supporting and promoting diverse books from established and emerging writers of varying races, ethnicities, gender, sexuality, and political perspectives. In giving recommendations or sharing ideas and information, we will strive to always do so from the perspective of those not usually heard from or reached out to, while elevating #own voices and storytelling. In that, we will be inclusive to various writing platforms and ideas and share our mission connecting booksellers, readers, and writers. Mosaic Community is a nationwide group of BIPOC stores coming together to share author events, elevate BIPOC voices and ideas. So thank you. And with that now, I would like to introduce our moderator and guest, Imani Perry, because we are here to celebrate the publication of A Fugitive Pedagogy by today's featured author, Jarvis Givens, and to raise awareness about and support for Black bookstores, Black teachers, and Black study programs. The Black Teacher Archives is a major new research project, and it is being explored and headed up by Jarvis and Imani Perry. And speaking of Imani, she is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and a faculty associate with programs in law and public affairs, gender and sexuality studies, and jazz studies. Her writing and scholarship primarily focuses on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination crafted in response to and resistance against social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. She is the author of 6 books, including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, which received the Penn Bogart Weld Award for biography and was named in 2008 notable book by the New York Times. It also was honor book by the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Her most recent book is Breed, A Letter to My Sons, which was a finalist for the NAACP Image Award for Excellence in Nonfiction. Please welcome to our virtual stage, Imani Perry.
Thank you so much. It is my great delight and pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague and brilliant scholar, Jarvis R. Givens. I'm going to offer an introduction, and then he'll speak some, and then we will enter conversation. Jarvis R. Givens is an assistant professor of education and African American studies, and the Suzanne Young Murray Assistant Professor at the Radcliffe Institute of Harvard University. He specializes in the history of African American education. We are here to discuss his first book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching. It was just published this spring by Harvard University Press. He is also the co-editor of We Dare Say Love, Supporting Achievement in the Educational Life of Black Boys, which was a 2018 publication of Columbia University Teachers College Press. And his research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Millen Foundation, the William F. Milton Fund, and he is the recipient, he earned his PhD in African American Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. It has been such, just before handing the stage over to him, I would just say, in our project in which we are trying to do archival work and recuperate the legacies that Black educators and institution builders have left for us. It has been such an absolute joy to work with Professor Gibbons in this endeavor. I have yet to encounter another scholar who is more dedicated to the tradition and history. And you are going to love, if you haven't yet read this book, you're going to love it, and you're going to love hearing about it. And with that, I turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Perry, for that very generous introduction. I'm super excited to be here today to have this conversation, especially have this conversation with you, because I feel like we've been talking about the book from very early stages to the process when I was writing it, and then even after the past few months since it's been out. So this is looking forward to a very rich dialogue and the questions that I'm sure you have that will probe my thoughts on the matter and continue the conversation going. But first, I wanted to say thank you to the wonderful kind of collaborators on this event, Kaliba, but also the independent Black bookstores, Underground Books, the Collective Oakland, SO1 Books, Marcus Bookstore, where I bought my first copy of The Miseducation of the Negro when I was just finishing my freshman year at UC Berkeley, and also Frugal Bookstore, right here in Roxbury, Massachusetts, where I'm currently at, where I met your mother a number of times, Imani, when I first got here, and got connected with a lot of wonderful Black teachers in the local community here doing work for Black students in the tradition of the educators that I'm writing about in this book and that we're studying and trying to lift up through the archive project that we're doing. But I just have a few comments that I wanted to share to kind of frame the theme of this particular event, right? Black teachers, Black bookstores, and the struggle against miseducation, to talk about where that comes from for me and how it's relevant to this particular conversation about Black teachers, right? So I remember in 2004, when Edward P. Jones won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel, The Known World. I was a junior at King Drew High School in Watts, and I'd never heard of the author, but this moment became a time of celebration at our school. Someone got the idea to create a reading marathon, during one of the school days where students would shut themselves in the auditorium and read the entire book aloud, or as much of it as time would permit. This idea came from the 24-hour reading marathons that Miss Yvonne Hutchinson, one of the school's veteran English teachers, hosted annually at her home during the winter holiday, beginning in 1989, which just so happens to be the year of my birth, right? The year I was born. The books for these marathons always came from SO1 Bookstore. Our ritualized patronage of this local Black bookstore was one that carried deeply embedded and important lessons that I still find myself to be studying and unraveling today. What's funny is that many students, myself included, somehow convinced ourselves that Miss Hutch owned SO1, which was not the case, right? And I'm certain that I wasn't the only student to have misinformed others when bragging about my teacher who owned her own bookstore. But during these reading marathons, I want to say something that was important about them. During these reading marathons, we gathered around some chosen text, we read, we debated. Some people fell asleep and woke up 30 pages later. Not me though, right? But some people fell asleep and woke up 30 pages later. But we picked apart the worlds reflected in the words of writers like Toni Morrison, of James McBride, of Ernest Gaines, and were ultimately tasked with trying to use some piece of them to sustain and build our own worlds. This was something like our watch service, a way of anticipating the new year and setting our intentions. Events such as these modeled for us what our shared love for words and worlding did, and that it did not have to be limited to the classroom or to the protocols of school policy or curriculum. At their best, Black bookstores and Black teachers are two manifestations of a single tradition. So historically speaking, Black teachers
were enfleshed representations of the fugitive pedagogy that I describe in my book. And Black bookstores, in so many ways, represent an institutional embodiment of that same tradition. An educational heritage derived from the escape practices of the enslaved. Those operating in the methods described by the abolitionist, poet, and teacher, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who wrote the following in 1872. But some of us would try to steal a little from the book and put the words together and learn by hook or crook. I remember Uncle Caldwell, who took pot liquor fat and greased the pages of his book and hid it in his hat. So this tradition of learning as a means of escape, as Carter G. Woodson called it, persisted well into the Jim Crow era. Black people sought out meaningful education, often doing so in ways that undermined a dominant school structure that was fundamentally anti-Black. One particular teacher that I feature in my book that comes to mind helps clarify this point. And his name is Willis N Huggins, originally from Selma, Alabama, who began teaching in New York public schools in 1924. For some time, he was the only African-American educator hired as a history teacher in the school system. But his educational work extended well beyond Brooklyn's Bushwick High School. He was the local president for the New York City branch of Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Huggins also established the Blyden Bookstore in Harlem, where he taught Sunday morning sessions on Negro history. He was a contemporary of the infamous Arturo Schomburg and a friend and associate of Jessie Fawcett, who was also a teacher and a novelist. And it was John Henrik Clark from Union Springs, Alabama, who would explain that it was in community spaces like the Blyden Bookstore that he came to know Huggins as a master teacher. Clark explained the following, quote, "I became active in the Harlem History Club headed by Willis N Huggins. We were young people trying to find a definition of African people in history, literally looking on the other side of the slavery curtain to see what kind of people we were before the advent of slavery. Huggins was a master teacher and the first political analyst I had ever met. Huggins continued his writing and during the Italian-Ethiopian War went to Ethiopia. He then returned to the United States and opened that bookstore on 7th Avenue. It was the first fully equipped bookstore in Harlem," end quote. So I wanted to stop there, but I wanted to both pay homage to, one, my own teachers, right? But also to give you a little glimpse of some of the teachers that appear in this book and talk about the kind of scope and the range of the things that they did that for so long, unfortunately, have been kind of a submerged history, right? And so now I want to invite Professor Perry back for us to kind of do what we do, is just to talk about these wonderful things that Black folks have always been doing, right? And specifically to talk about the rich educational tradition that I think has a lot to offer our moment.
Wonderful. So it's so moving and delightful to see your teacher, Ms. Hutchinson, and I hope we get to hear a few words from her before the evening is done. But I wanted to start by asking you about Carter G. Woodson's role in this book, right? Because it's not a book about Carter G. Woodson, but he is in some sense sort of the what lit the flame, right, as it were, right, for the book itself. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, Carter G. Woodson, I should say, so the project started when I came across a reference to these textbooks that Carter G. Woodson wrote, right? It was actually why I come across a footnoted reference, and I had mentioned Jessie Fawcett in relationship to Willis Huggins, but it was also a book review because Jessie Fawcett was a school teacher, but also the editor of the Crisis magazine. She had wrote a review for this textbook. And I was familiar with Carter G. Woodson because as I mentioned, I had read The Miseducation of the Negro when I was a college student at UC Berkeley. And I had come to learn that he was the father of Black history. But I knew very little about his time as a school teacher. I didn't realize that he was a public school teacher, right? He had a PhD in history from Harvard. I would never think to associate him with being a school teacher in public K through 12 schools. But he was for nearly 30 years. And I became really interested in studying studying Black teachers as intellectuals. And Carter G. Woodson became a very important figure to think about that, because his life just really ran the gamut of the range of Black education, right? He's the child of formerly enslaved people. He's born in Buckingham County, Virginia in 1875. Both of his parents were enslaved, and his first teachers were his formerly enslaved uncles, right? Then he goes off to, Berea College, spends a semester at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, gets an additional undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago and a master's there, and then gets a PhD from Harvard as a school teacher, and then works to completely reject so much of his own kind of educational trajectory in very elite white universities. And I felt like there was something in his story that really opened up a lot of important dynamics in the history of Black education, about power, about knowledge, and about Black teachers organizing as well, and building also.
Yeah, I mean, I love this point about that's at the center of the book. You do a lot of major interventions, and I want to talk about a couple of them, but this idea of understanding Black teachers, both in terms of are intellectuals, engage in intellectual work that is often sort of counter hegemonic, and organizers, right? And all of that feels like, our educators in our communities know it, but that it's sort of a revelation to the rest of the world. And there's something that you talk about in the introduction that to me is such a profound point about the grammar of Black education. And you talk about the forces that are at work within sort of the space of Black communities and the forces without, and the sort of navigation. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, and so this is, thank you for that question, and for getting at the kind of heart of one of the things that I feel like I was struggling with the book, right? Which is, for me, the thing that became very difficult when I encountered Carter G. Woodson's textbooks, and then started to, look into that. And he wasn't the first Black teacher to publish a textbook, right? There's Lila Amos Pendleton. She's a teacher who publishes a textbook in 1912. And the frames that I had been given to think about the history of Black education seemed inconsistent with the stories of these teachers. And it forced me to have to figure out, well, how do we make sense of all this stuff about, that's associated with Brown versus the Board of Education, which was invested in having to prove the lack and the deficiency of Black education, to argue, right? This is a legal strategy, right? To argue about the deficiencies and the aggressive neglect of Black schools, painting a picture of dilapidated school buildings falling apart, right? And not to say that aggressive neglect was not a part of the story, it absolutely was, right? The under-resourced, that separate and unequal, a very important narrative, and it's true. But you can't take that to be the full reality of Black people's lives and their educational experiences, right? So this legal strategy can't be conflated with Black educational reality on the ground. When you have, this tradition of people who are literally given everything they have to the building of schools immediately after slavery, and even during the period of slavery, right? Creating clandestine schools in secret. After the Civil War, the first thing the freed people do is they pull together their resources and they build schools. In fact, the very first public education system in the Southern states is the result of the organizing of formerly enslaved Black people, right? And so this idea of the grammar of Black education is me trying to say, well, it's important for us to take care and attend to the structural neglect that is true, that narrative of separate and unequal,
but we also have to recognize this consistent straining against those constraints as really the kind of this tension that really shapes the experience of Black education. Black education is experienced at the intersection of those competing forces, right? And you can't have one without the other. It's not an overly triumphant narrative, but it's also not a story of defeat, right? It's about how do we tell a story that attends to both of those things. And that's what the book, that's what I was trying to do with the book, is to offer a balanced account of that.
Yeah. No, and I you do extremely well. And for me, you know, I feel like in some sense we get caught in these like this binary often in Black studies, right? So either the system is completely defeating, right? And or it is you know, here's this sort of revolutionary or transformative moment. And what I think you do with the history of educators and their intellectual work is you actually reveal both the reality of navigating a repressive society and seeking liberation, but also the pathway, right, to movement, right? That it's, you know, when we say, and we're increasingly we'll say, okay, that's the case, like political organizations work over years, but to understand education as a site of building the kind of people who will be able to transform the society is really important, I think. And there's also a kind of recuperation that you're doing, right? Like there's a lot of collective memory that perhaps isn't being passed on. And so I wanted to actually ask you, well, one, to sort of talk a little bit about what precisely fugitive pedagogy is, right, conceptually, but also whether we still need it.
Right. So there's a number of ways I can kind of get at talking about fugitive pedagogy. But so the story that really pushed me to start to reconceptualize what I was trying to express and demonstrate in the book was a story about, and this is where the book opens, with a student named Jerry Moore, who's a student in Webster Parish, Louisiana. And he talks about Tessie McGee, his teacher, secretly reading from Carter G. Woodson's book that she kept in her lap underneath the desk. And he recalls someone coming into the classroom, and he says, you know, she stopped reading from the book and began reading from the required outline on top of the desk. Then when the person leaves the classroom, her eyes went back to the book in her lap. I became obsessed with that one kind of moment and that one scene from this particular story, not because it was the only case of it, but there was plenty of other cases that I was able to kind of find where we find Black teachers operating subversively. But this particular story forced me to kind of reframe the entire story that I was trying to tell, and to say, this is actually, it's not just about, oh, the importance of Black history and teaching Black kids about, you know, the Negro first, the first Black person do this, first Black person do that. It's not about that, but it's also about the kind of politics and the way that Black teachers and students are learning how to navigate power, right? That was also very an important part, right? That was also that was a lesson that the students were learning, even as it wasn't something written in text. Though in Carter G. Woodson's textbook, there actually is the line when he talks about, you know, how some of the slaves learned to read makes for a beautiful story because they understood, he uses the language of learning as a means of escape, right? That's actually literally in the textbook that she's reading from, that has concealed underneath the desk, right? So this idea of escape, of subversion, of concealing critical parts of Black education was evident in the experiences of the enslaved people during slavery, and it continued to be practiced by Black teachers after emancipation, because we know that Black education continued to meet violent white opposition, right? Well, continuously, I was gonna say up and through the Jim Crow era, but you know, we have so many laws and things that are passing in various states currently. So we know that this is the kind of white backlash and these kind of white grievance politics that, as a part of this violent restraint that Black teachers were functioning under, continues to reappear throughout history. But that's what this idea of fugitive pedagogy is getting at. It's a political orientation to Black education that derives from enslaved Black people who acquired literacy and meaningful education by theft. And then it's about how Black people, continue to employ subversive intellectual and physical acts to subvert educational domination, right? So the physically concealing the textbook, right? But also the literal text that Carter G. Woodson is writing, that's telling a completely new story about human history, right? That challenges distortions about Black life and dominant curriculum. Both that intellectual work that teachers were doing and the physical navigation of power is what constitutes fugitive pedagogy.
Okay, yeah. And do you think of, because, for me, it was really wonderful to be able to have read your work before we started on this project, right? Where we're trying to sort of collect the journals that Black educators put together, because even though, for my own work, it was important because I thought, oh, here's a treasure trove of information, but how imperative it is, right? Like, to understand the intellectual and political sophistication of what they were doing in, state and the national colored teachers associations. And I guess I wonder, the question that I'm sort of trying to get at, in part because of sort of what we're trying to do in the institutions that we're in, and what we see K-12 educators trying to do in their institutions with a lot of constraint, is really how you see the sort of the lessons of the past have, bearing on what we do now, right? So it's not like fugitive in quite the same way, right? We're not hiding that we're doing Black studies work, but in a sense, it's still, do you think it's in some ways still fugitive?
I absolutely think that there is so if there's absolutely a kind of a competing set of interests that are at play between many of the institutions that we oftentimes have to work within in order to do work. But the moral imperative at the center of our work is often at odds with the very institutions, right? So if we're talking about these teachers who are operating in Jim Crow schools, right? They are in but not of those schools, right? Black teachers, these teachers that we're writing about, are operating in a tradition that is, challenging the very educational landscape that they're having to function within. I absolutely think that same level of kind of crisis at the heart of the work, is absolutely a part of the work that, the best of study scholarship, I would say, because I think there's a wide range of, this scholarship, and I'm not necessarily a fan of all of it, but I do think at the heart of the work, at its highest calling, that continues to be true. There continues to be these competing narratives and these competing interests, and because if you're pursuing a kind of a knowledge system and trying to pursue offering a new perspective on what it means to be human, right? That's accounting for the Black perspective, when so much of everything else that we've learned, or that's been taught and that's been created as knowledge and held up as knowledge, was fundamentally built on the subjugation of Black people, right? This project completely, is working to rewrite or to kind of outspeak that entire body of knowledge. And this is the project that Carter G. Woodson was engaging in. He's literally in creating an organization to study Negro life and history, right? And to say that the Negro has history, and to write back against all of the dominant and powerful white elite people at places like Harvard and Yale, and even at some HBCUs at the time, who were in control of, because he wasn't able to be a professor at Howard University because of the conflicts he had with the white president at the time, right? He's literally working to rewrite the epistemological order. And I think if we understand Black studies to be that project, it's absolutely very much so still a part of this tradition, or should be, and should be accountable to this tradition.
And, I love that example too, because there are all kinds of institutions that can be kind of resistant to the Black studies tradition. They're not necessarily white institutions, frankly. And similarly, right, William Leo Hansberry was never tenured at Howard, and he's the author of the field of African studies, right? And so, you know, one of the things that it makes me think about too is this sort of is how your book challenges. Okay, so in history over the past, as a field, right, over the past, I don't know, 4 decades, there's been this push against like great figure history, like let's focusing on individuals and to be focused on people and collectives. But in that shift, we haven't seen much, relatively speaking, in the way of like Black professional or institutional organizing, right? It's like, or political organize, but not like sort of in particular work areas. Okay, you know, there's been some work on, you know, the organization of domestic laborers and church organizations, but less in this sort of, you know, realm of work, and especially intellectual work. And for me, it gives the impression that, you know, there's just this tiny handful of intellectuals, right? And then there's like the laborers. So you really focus on our attention on the broad community of people who go relatively nameless in the history books, but who are doing serious intellectual work in our communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like, you know, all of these teachers that no one would know anything about, right? That are sustaining so many of these important, you know, organizations and institutions that sometimes we can come to think about in terms of a single figure, right? This is partly at play even in this book, right? Carter G. Woodson is the founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. But one of the things that I try to show, even as I take his life and open it up, is to demonstrate how to, in order to get a full accounting of Woodson's life, we have to think about these kind of social relations in this networked world that he's a product of and that he operated within, right? And when you do that, you have to take seriously these teachers like Tessie McGee, who's in this rural school in Webster Parish, Louisiana, secretly reading from this textbook published by, you know, Carter G. Woodson in Washington, D.C. Oh, well, how did they get this? Because these teachers in colored teacher associations, you know, they have study groups where they're trying to engage with ideas that are in scholarship that's being produced by the Black intellectual elite, right? They're interacting with that, thinking about it, and trying to figure out how it might be used in service of their own work. And I think it's really important to kind of go back and to really study in order to, you know, it's institutional history, but it's also an important part of social history, because these institutions are coming from the kind of social and on the ground organizing that Black folks are doing. And so, yeah, I think part of the reason that sometimes it can be difficult to study these Jim Crow institutions, because some people might think that you're trying to glorify these segregated, you know, the period of segregation, as though we can't think about the good that Black people created under these conditions and still condemn the kind of legal structure that was, you know, anti-Black and built on kind of subjugating Black life. So you can do both of these things. We can still say that Black people were not just only suffering and like didn't think about what meaningful education could be, right? We know that that's not possible, but because we have so many of these people who were the students and the products of these schools, right? Whether it be Martin Luther King Jr. or Angela Davis or Zora Neale Hurston or any of the important Black minds and leaders, right, through the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of them are products of these schools. And they weren't there by themselves, they were taught by someone. And these were very dedicated and well-studied teachers that for whatever reason, we've just kind of we've overlooked. And so, yeah.
No, I mean, it's just, I love those examples. Just as you were talking, I was like, just for the audience who may not know, to think about, you know, Zora Neale Hurston and boarding school, Florida Baptist Academy, or, you know, Jessie Foster, we talked about earlier, having taught James Baldwin, right? So there are these networks of people who were part of creating these household names who we just not only don't know, but presume didn't exist often in the common. And I think that's a problem even in the field Black studies, frankly, right? There's this, and sort of relatedly, also, I want to encourage people to put any questions you may have in the Q&A, because we're coming up on Q&A time. But you know, even thinking about Carter G. Woodson, because in many ways, he's not an iconic figure in Black studies the way a number of his peers and some of his, you know, nemesis were, he didn't get along with. And I wonder about if you think that's related actually to what he was trying to do with the production of knowledge.
Yeah, I do think that, I think there's a number of things that come to mind for that. And I would say it's ironic is that because we celebrate Black History Month every year, and it's like, this is the person that found, exactly, it's like, you know, who founded and created Negro History Week in 1926 that becomes Black History Month that we celebrate today. And it's like, that only, you know, it became popular because of all of these teachers who were taking it and putting it into practice, and all of these schools and having Black kids memorize Paul Laurence Dunbar poems and sing the Black National Anthem by James Weldon Johnson, right? And read Black literature and all this stuff. Like, it becomes popular because these teachers put it into practice in their schools, and we've inherited Black History Month in the form that it takes today, right? And there's a lot to be critical of in terms of the way Black History Month is celebrated today, and the way that it departs from this origin story, right? But in terms of why Woodson falls out, at least in the field of education, I'll say something about this, is that I think we've been so beholden to this Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois binary, and this kind of debate that we're taught. If you do hear anything about the history of Black education in your K through 12 schools, is going to talk about this debate between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, right? And even in the university settings about, yes, we have scholarship that moves beyond it, but the dominant framing has continued to talk about practical versus industrial education, which is a binary that is a complete distortion because it doesn't even represent Booker T. Washington's full range of thinking or W.E.B. Du Bois. But, you know, I would go and I would present some of the early research I was doing on Carter G. Woodson at conferences, and people would say, you know, so would you say he's more of a Washingtonian kind of, you know, educator and educational thinker, or more of a Du Boisian kind of thinker? And I struggled for a minute trying to figure out where to put him into this. And I was like, well, it's because this framing is completely a distortion of the range of Black intellectual thought in education, but it also it masks the real story, which is part of what Woodson was critiquing, which was white philanthropy's role in facilitating this dysfunction in Black education by industrial philanthropists saying you can only get money to fund these schools, right? And obviously talking to people who are one generation out of slavery, saying you can only get money to fund these schools if you do education this way, practical education, right? And then you have the missionary philanthropists that are saying, no, it needs to be classical liberal arts education. And so you have this white money, white philanthropy, right, facilitating this dysfunction, but we remember it as these two figures who were slightly aligned with one or the other, right? When really Booker T. Washington's daughter goes to Fisk, which is kind of like, you know, the epitome of a liberal arts education. So obviously there was some leeway there for him. And Du Bois never completely wrote off industrial education, right? But I'm saying this to say is those sorts of framings were things that I was trying to write outside of when I was talking about this idea of the grammar of Black education and trying to think more expansively about structure, but also the kind of social history and cultural history of Black folks on the ground and how we can talk about both of these things. And I felt like Woodson was a good historical figure that allowed me to do that, but then also opened up opportunities to talk about this very rich and expansive intellectual history of Black teachers.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do that extremely well. And for me, that's why it, you know, it's a paradigm shift in work, right? Because to refuse that frame and to create a larger terrain with more figures, but also as a model for how we look even at an individual figure, right? So that even when you hone in on somebody, it is important to understand the institutions, the communities through which they navigate. I mean, I think that's a lesson for scholars across the board. So I have a few more minutes before we go to Q&A. What would you say are the primary things that you want your readers to leave the book knowing, right? Like when they put it down, what do you want them to bring out into the world? And I mean, both, you know, the worlds of schools and universities, but also writ broadly.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things is that there's a lot that we can learn from the way that these teachers, they modeled a different way of what it means to be a teacher in many ways, right? I think that, and this is me particularly thinking about folks who are educators, if they're K-12 educators, but I think it has implications for anyone who does education in any kind of way, is I think that these teachers offer a counter narrative about what it means to be a teacher and the moral imperatives that come along with that particular vocation, right? When your interest is to, when your desire and your calling is to serve, especially you're talking about teaching Black children, right? What's politically at stake in that work? I think, you know, these teachers had a political clarity around that, and that political clarity shaped the way that they engaged in the work as intellectuals, how they studied both content, their content areas, but also the political context of schools, right? And that shaped how they navigated the educational context that they found themselves in, right? They didn't operate as individual teachers trying to do great things. They were building, they built these colored teacher associations that we write about, right? That allowed them to have this advocacy base to reinforce and support the political work that they were trying to do, even within a school structure that was hostile to their very existence and the political work they were trying to do. I think that those sorts of lessons in terms of that social history and that organizing and the way that that shapes both the form of the work in terms of the way that it takes form, but also how it functions in the lives of students, right? Because many of these students, in the, you know, when they recall the work that their teachers were doing, it wasn't just about the content of what they were learning, but it was about the experience of the education that also helped shape their own political vision for the world that they were trying to seek out and that they were trying to create, right? So this is why you see things like, and the teachers were very intentional about this. You'll see people like Lucy Craft Laney very explicitly saying, we're gonna teach civics in these schools, even as we know Black people are not, we're in the South, Black people are disenfranchised, can't vote, but they're still teaching civics in very intentional kinds of ways because these resources and things that they're gaining help them to critique the society that they're living within. And then the stories and things from people like Carter G. Woodson in terms of Black history and culture also helps them see a much more complicated and dynamic picture of what it means to be Black people, to be a Black person, what Black people have done in the world, right? And that also becomes an important resource for crafting and shaping their own identities. And it wasn't only, it's not only about the, you know, Black history and culture that's important, because you had teachers that were teaching Latin and Greek, right? And even those kind of courses were used toward political ends because it was the political orientation to the work that shaped, that went into shaping the minds and the students' understanding of what it was that they were doing, right? And so we have to kind of, I think that there's something that we can learn from these teachers about what people today call social emotional learning, right? And thinking about, you know, anti-racist teaching, right? This is not something that's new and novel, though people act like it is, right? These Black teachers had always been doing anti-racist teaching because their lives depended on it, really. And so those are some of the things that come to mind, but I think certainly there's much more, but those are a couple of takeaways that I would say. I could probably talk about this for a long time.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm stepping back because it's time for Q&A.
And I'm stepping back in, and I gotta say, wow, as someone that works in the book industry and with booksellers, I can't wait to get my hands on this book and get this book into the hands of anybody and everybody. And also as the daughter, the product of a lifelong teacher and the educator in the Detroit school system. This is just so amazing, and she would be proud. So thank you for sharing this, both of you, and thank you for taking on this project. It's so interesting, and we do have a few questions. I think Calvin's also may step in with a few, but to start off with, Carlos.
We were going to have Miss Hutchinson pop in.
Oh, that's
first.
right. That's right. Oh, yes. I can't wait to meet her. You spoke so eloquently of Miss Hutchinson, also a lifelong educator. Please, can we bring her in? Hi. Oh, we can't hear you.
We have to have, there we go.
Okay. This is phenomenal. This is phenomenal. It's taking me a while to come to grips with Jarvis, my high school student, being Professor Gibbons at Harvard University. And what I started reading the book, it distressed me, but it didn't surprise me that Black teachers were subject to all kinds of oppression, even murder, that they had to resort to subterfuge in order to educate their Black students. So I wanted to speak to that tradition of the Black teachers being a pivotal participants in terms of the freedom that comes from being educated. And I was born in the South, Little Rock, Arkansas. I started my education at Frederick Douglass Elementary School in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And I had a teacher named Miss Kay Walker Code, who impressed me so much that in the first grade, I decided I was going to be a teacher. I never wavered from that. The other teacher who was a fugitive of sorts was my mother. And she told me that she was born in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. And she told me that teachers were held in such high esteem that they were all referred to as professor. So I taught my students, after you, Jarvis, but I taught my students to call me Professor Hutch. Not because of egotism, but because it symbolizes the deep respect that teachers had from the period that you're talking about, as epitomized by Carter G. Woodson. And it just thrills me to no end to see that Jarvis has come from the classroom King Drew, having been exposed to teachers like Miss Guy, Miss Jones, who turned out to be one of his students in his doctorate class, Mr. Siegel, I think he's listening. There are other colleagues, but what I wanted to say was that I think that this book is important because it is a history of the tradition that still continues. We may not be fugitive educators, but we are educators who are oftentimes constrained to give our students the kind of instruction through text that Jarvis mentioned. And that's one of the reasons why I started the 24-hour reading marathon. Most of the books that we read were about the struggle and about how we as Black people address the sociological, the psychological, the political, the cultural challenges of being Black in this society. So somebody had a question about, okay, what implications does this have for Black educators now? And so I would pose that question, and excuse me for stealing your question, the person who wrote it. I would put, huh?
That's a great question. It's a number of things that come to mind, but I wanted you to finish your thought though, then I'll respond.
Well, no, I was just saying I had the same question before we even started listening to you, because I read part of your book. And I see this as a continuum, that we had teachers who had to be fugitives, but we do still have teachers who have to be, I don't know what the term is, fugitive, but who are stimulating and activating and agitating our students to develop those sharp and critical minds, which you are such an exemplar of. So that the question is, what's the implication now for us as Black educators? And I want to say one other thing. My granddaughter is 13. When she was in the 5th grade, her teacher, who's also a Black teacher with a PhD, said, okay, so we're going to look at, we're going to study history. And my granddaughter said, and she was about, what, 9 then, she said, you mean white history? She said, because we were looking at this textbook. And so she said, you mean white history? And her teacher said, you're absolutely right, Jasmine. And she proceeded to teach them, instruct them in spite of this book. So I just wanted you to discourse on that question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And one of the things I want to point out is, you know, you said you attended the Frederick Douglass Elementary School. I would like to point out, you know, that it's interesting that you'll find Frederick Douglass schools in a number of places. Obviously, Frederick Douglass, a fugitive slave who learned to read and write in secret, right? Carter G. Woodson also attended the Frederick Douglass School in Huntington, West Virginia, right? So you have, one of the things that became interesting to me was the way in which the folk hero of fugitive slaves like Harriet Tubman, like Frederick Douglass, were embedded in the curricular imaginations of Black teachers in very important ways, even when we see it showing up in the school naming practices, right? I just wanted to point that out. But to your question about what does this mean today, I think that we have so many studies that tell us about Black teachers feeling alienated and estranged in the context of schools where they work, right? If there's a lesson that I think comes from, well, all teachers in the United States, teachers are deprofessionalized and are underappreciated, and that is especially the case for Black teachers. I think that these spaces, in the organizing spaces, the associations that Black teachers historically created, were important for them to help sustain themselves in these very hostile school structures, right? So I think the organizing history that we have in this book that these teachers demonstrate, I think that what they modeled as intellectuals, right? As people who were interrogating the curriculum materials they were being given to teach, and who were studying books by people like W.B. Du Bois, right? And people like Mary McLeod Bethune leading as the president of these teacher associations, saying, we need you to translate, literally, she used the language of to be translators of this important scholarship being published in the Journal of Negro History to the context of, you know, curriculum for students, right? We can trace this kind of work being said by people like Mary McLeod Bethune, and then actually see teachers doing it, organizing themselves in places like New Orleans, in Little Rock, Arkansas, right? Because there's the Arkansas Colored Teachers Association. They're actually operating as intellectuals, not just practitioners, right? They're scholars of the practice, studying pedagogical models, studying and reading books and thinking about what needs to be offered to students, how that might be in tension with the formalized curriculum, but they're always doing these things. So I think that the definition and the model of what it means to be a teacher, what it means to organize around education for the purposes of, you know, Black liberation, if you're thinking about the interests of Black students, that kind of organizing history, I think, is important for educators today. And it's also, you know, fulfilling for Black teachers to recognize that there's a long tradition for them to see themselves in relationship to, right? These problems that you have today are not new, right? They take on new forms in some ways, but they're about the same kind of social dynamics and power dynamics that Black educators have always been up against. And it's important for Black teachers to have a long memory of this so that they can shape a more kind of, formed and developed professional identity that's rooted in these traditions. That's what I would say. And so now I want to we probably should jump and see a couple of more, some of these questions that are here. Someone asked, oh, I'm sorry, Paula, were you gonna jump in? I see a question about Woodson's diasporic lens. And
yeah, please go ahead,
yeah, so I see a question asking about Woodson's diasporic lens. That was something that was very interesting to me, right? To learn that these teachers were actually thinking internationally about Blackness and Black experience, right? There are, in Carter G. Woodson's textbooks, they're writing about, Afro-Brazilian history. He's writing about Afro-Brazilian history. He's writing about resistance in places like Suriname. So we're talking a lot today in scholarship about Black internationalism, but these teachers, when we look at the textbooks that are published by Woodson, that writings by Richard Robert Wright in Georgia, by Lila Amos Pendleton, they're writing about the Haitian Revolution and offering these as narratives for students to have a much broader perspective on what it means to be Black, and to also understand that their experience of racial domination in the US is actually tied to a global system of anti-Blackness, right? And this shows up especially in Carter G. Woodson's work. And I think that that's something that's really important, is that in the early 20th century, Black intellectuals and Black teachers as well were thinking in diasporic terms. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm noticing a few other questions. I feel like to a certain extent you have kind of answered a little bit, but maybe they want you to focus on certain things. And one of them says, would you like to see your work play in empowering contemporary teachers towards better serving marginalized students? And I would add to that, marginalized, covering several ethnicities throughout the country.
Yeah, well, I think so. The book is very clearly about Black teachers and Black people, but I think that there are universal themes that can be extracted from this story about what it means for a subjugated people to pursue an education in service of their needs, and what that means in terms of how they're navigating power in the context of an oppressive schooling regime, right? I think that there's a reason, there's a book called The Miseducation of the Filipino, right, which kind of builds on a number of the lessons and themes that come from the miseducation of the Negro, right? Because the things that Woodson is talking about resonates with, scholars who are writing about education in colonial contexts, right? Whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere. And so absolutely, I think that what we see is a story about teachers who are teachers that are of the people who are being marginalized and oppressed, and what it means for them to cultivate a pedagogical project that has a deep, incisive social analysis of the power structure that they're within, and to develop a pedagogical model that extends from that. So I think that's something that applies to other groups, even if you're not African American, though this particular history is distinct to African Americans.
For sure, for sure. And yeah, and I think that's why they said marginalized, but we all know which group of people were marginalized the most, especially during the time period when you were talking, you're focusing on, but to bring it up to contemporary times, obviously that broadens. And I know you have a reading selected for us, and we'd love to have you read a little bit.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah. So, I'll read a short part from chapter 2, and I'm going to read this part because it's talking about Black institutional life in the context of education, and I think this is a really important part of. Right. I'm happy you got your book, Ms. Yeah. So I'm gonna read the beginning part of chapter 2, and it's about the kind of thinking about the formation of Carter G. Woodson's organization. But I was saying that this is important because it also speaks to the history of Black teacher associations that is a part of this archive project that Imani and I are developing to work to preserve these institutions, the history of these institutions that Black teachers created. The year 1915 was spiteful. It marked the half-century anniversary of Black emancipation in the United States, which came with the passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865. The anniversary, already sullied by the apartheid conditions of Jim Crow, became even more a travesty when The Birth of a Nation first premiered as The Klansman in California on January 1, 1915. President Woodrow Wilson screened the film at the White House on February 18, 2 days before President Abraham Lincoln's birthday and a month before the 50th anniversary of his assassination. It was released as The Birth of a Nation in New York on March 2nd. The most popular and innovatively produced and directed film to ever come before the American public, centered on denigrating the image of Black people while portraying the Ku Klux Klan as protectors and saviors of the nation. The film epitomized at least two key features of America's progressive era: great technological innovation and the condemnation of Blackness. African Americans around the country exerted great energy on their 50th anniversary of emancipation, organizing and protesting against the slanderous film, as the Crisis magazine dubbed it. The lynching of 56 Black Americans in 1915 also marked this milestone, a 10% increase from the previous 2 years based on the recorded number of incidents. The question and meaning of Black freedom, Black progress, and Black life concerned all Black Americans living during this low point in the race's history. Studying the past and how it structured the present and futures could not have been more important than on this occasion commemorating 50 years on the other side of slavery. On September 9, 1915, Carter G. Woodson founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. He founded the association with a distinct mission: to transform the representation of Black life and culture in Western knowledge, and in doing so, to transform knowledge itself. However, the political ethos embedded within this mission resonated with the many Black institutions that preceded it. Black institutions were a vital line of defense for African American social and political life. They were centers of refuge, sites for alternative education and political advocacy, and more generally, a web of networks forming a counterpublic to address the needs of a civically estranged people. Anti-Black exclusion partly triggered the formation of these institutions, but to assume that this was the sole reason for their emergence, or that they mimicked the aims and ideals of the white public sphere, where Black inclusion hinged on domination, would be a mistake. Similar to the invisible institution where Black Americans engaged in independent religious worship, clandestine schools during slavery, and colored conventions that began during the antebellum period. It's a nod to Professor Foreman, who I know is here in the chat. There continue to be covert objectives at the center of Black institutional life post-emancipation. Woodson's association was unprecedented. It is the first and longest running academic organization devoted to the study of race, and its ancillary publications, the Journal of Negro History and the Negro History Bulletin, produced a body of knowledge that challenged and eventually transformed established schools of thought in the American Academy. This organization is essential to the story of Black education. While no brick and mortar school, the ASNLH symbolized something much greater: an institution founded by a Black school teacher with the intent of rewriting the epistemological order, the basis of all curricula and school models. Black educators, especially teachers in primary through secondary schools, formed a critical base within the organization's membership, and by the 1930s, one of its most reliable sources of financial support. So I'll end there.
And we lost Paula, but oh my God, thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Yvonne. Thank you, Imani. This was amazing. We will have the video posted and we'll share it out to the participating stores, Isawan, Frugal Books, Marcus Books in Oakland, and Underground, of course, in Sacramento, and my friends at the Book Collective Oakland. So thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, Jarvis.